The motto of police forces around the world is usually protect and serve. The thing is though, sometimes that involves investigating the darkest parts of human society, the strange buildings and disturbing people that you only ever hear stories about. Well, these are 10 of those creepiest stories that I could find. My name is Danny Burke. I hope you're sitting comfortably because we're about to get into the top 10 scary police discoveries. Starting off at number 10 now, we have The Disturbance. This one comes from a 19-year-old fresh police recruit who was called to a domestic dispute by concerned neighbours. When they got to the house and opened the door, a swarm of rats just poured straight out of the house. The lights and TV were on, but nobody was home. They looked everywhere, but couldn't find a single person. After waiting for a while for the owners to return, they just left. A few minutes later, they got another call from neighbours saying there was arguing coming from the same house again. This time, they brought the dog squad, but again, the house was just empty. It got even stranger when they found the toilet had just been flushed, like seconds before they had been into the house, and also the kettle was on the boil. What do you guys think of all that? Slippery suspects or the supernatural? Next up at number 9 now, we have The Twisted Mind. User Jaws76 is a police officer who told Reddit that years ago he was called to a body dumped in the stairway of a public housing building. As they arrived, they propped open the door with a doormat. A nice young man came and gave them a hand until they secured the scene. The victim was in a shocking state, multiple slashes and stab marks all over his body, and he was covered in burns. The really strange thing was his clothes were perfectly clean. The medical team said his body was totally drained of blood and there were no signs of decomposition. It was a real mystery. Months later, an arrest was finally made. The suspect was the nice guy who had helped them when they arrived. It turns out that he and his girlfriend were friends with the victim when they began arguing one night. They beat him unconscious, tied him to a chair and tortured him for 2 days. When he finally died, they drained his body in the bath, changed his clothes and threw him down the stairs. The murderer then had the audacity to help the officers who arrived at the scene. What a twisted mind. Next up at number 8 now, we have The Monster. User Ultimate Space Wizard told Reddit a story that comes from his girlfriend's granddad who used to be a detective. Now when he was new on the job, he got called to an apartment because a so-called monster was trying to get into someone's house. The caller said they heard a gunshot and then a while later a banging on the door. They opened the door to see what they called a monster just standing there and then trying to get in. They slammed the door and called the police. By the time the officers got there, this had happened to other apartments nearby too. When the detective arrived, he found the monster stumbling around the building. It turns out it was actually a guy who had tried to kill himself with a shotgun blast to the head. He got the angle wrong though and blew off his mouth and nose, but he was still alive. He then stumbled around looking like this to the other apartments in absolute shock, trying to get help, but everyone was so scared of his appearance they just kept the door shut. That one is both scary and sad. At number 7 now, we have the Scarecrow. This story goes that the police were called to the house of an old couple who said there was a man standing in their backyard at night. The officers showed up and split into 2 groups, each heading down one side of the house. As they approached him in the dark, they ordered him to get down on the ground and put his hands behind his back. He didn't move. It turns out that just a few hours before, a suspect had robbed a nearby store, and as he fled, he ran through that backyard. He tried to get over the fence but slipped and fell all the way down right onto a fence post, impaling him. He couldn't lift himself up and his own weight slowly pulled him down. The pole entered his groin and ended up reaching his shoulder. The story was grimly referred to by the police department as the Scarecrow incident. At number 6 now, we have Writing on the Wall. Reddit user Cop Without Vest told a story about the time he and his partner were called to check on the welfare of a person. The ex-boyfriend of a woman had called and he said he was concerned about her after receiving texts from her saying that she wished it never ended and that she couldn't go on any longer without him. The police officers got to her place but there was no answer at the door. They called the number that the guy had given them, but although they could hear the phone ringing inside, she didn't pick up. They heard some slurred speech from the other side of the door and finally it unlocked but it didn't open. When they stepped inside, they found her standing in the dark, naked, wet and swaying on one spot. Her hands were bleeding. An ambulance came and took her away. The creepiest was yet to come though. None of the lights would turn on in the house. Instead, they just found candles lit in the bathroom and bedroom. On the walls, there were Bible scripture quotes written in her own blood. The bath was filled with brown water, a mixture of water and blood. They concluded she had been sitting in the bath there for hours and and they weren't even sure how she survived. Next up at number 5 now, we have the werewolf. This one comes from Reddit user Punman42, who said he used to be a police officer in a small town in Ohio called Celeryville. He said one night his daughter was in her bedroom and drew back the curtains to look out of the window. To her absolute horror, standing outside was what she described as a werewolf staring right back at her. She screamed and ran to her dad, who didn't really believe her. As a police officer, he would have seen a lot of strange things, but a werewolf? He saw the fear in her eyes though and walked around the perimeter of the house with a pistol and a flashlight. He found nothing. A week later, he and his co-worker were called to investigate a case of a peeping Tom. Some guy was staring in at people's windows at night. When they caught him, he was wearing a werewolf costume. He was dressing up in it so that people would never believe the witnesses and he could just return to watch them again night after night. I think I would probably run through a wall if I saw that outside my house at night. Moving on to number 4 now, we have the cult. Reddit user Caleb23 said they were called to a graveyard one night to find a cult of people who were apparently digging up bodies and doing, in his own words, freaky religious crap with them. Luckily, when they got there, they hadn't actually started digging yet. Instead, they were just wearing strange outfits and chanting around the graves. He said the sight disturbed him more than any suicide or vehicle accident he saw before or after. He went to go and arrest them, but his field training officer told him not to. The young cop was confused, but his boss said if you arrest them, they get the arrest report and they know your name. You don't want those people to know your name. At number 3 now, we have Christmas Eve. This story was posted online by a guy who said his granddad was an Irish police officer who started his career in Minneapolis in the mid 1950s. Now, he always told interesting stories about his long police career, but this Christmas Eve story was the scariest by far. He said that one night he got a call to a house on Christmas Eve that had 6 bodies in it. When he arrived, he found that he was the first officer on the scene. He walked around the house with his gun drawn and went room to room. In each room, he found the bodies of the family of 6. All of them were dead, but with no signs of a struggle. It just looked like they had fallen asleep. One minute they were alive, and the next they were dead. There was no explanation. Eventually, he went upstairs to the bathroom. There, lying in the bath, was the teenage girl of the family, dead and with a single lonely tear rolling down her cheek. He had to leave when investigators showed up, and he said that he never actually found out what happened. What do you guys think it was? Do we even want to know? That would probably haunt me. Moving on to number 2 now, we have The Voice. Reddit user Siege said they were once called to check on an elderly woman in her home. When they got there and there was no answer, they had to climb through a window at the back of the house. As they climbed through, they heard a loud television that was on in the next room, and they could tell it was the news. They called out, "Police, does anyone need help?" And then they heard an old raspy voice reply, "Here." They rushed down the hall to the next room and they found the old woman lying face down on the dining room table. The officer asked, "Ma'am, did you fall? Where are you hurt?" When they touched her hand, it was ice cold. She'd actually been dead for days. When the other officers arrived, they checked the house but found nobody else was there at all. The officer swore they heard the voice and they knew it wasn't from the TV. Do you guys have any explanations based on this information? I really hope you do. And finally at number 1 now, we have Mother of Demon. Reddit user Spartan337 said they were once called out after reports of a suspicious person outside a nearby house. When they got there, the guy said a woman was apparently standing on his driveway with a child-sized doll with horns and covered in blood. He said he asked her what she wanted and she said it needs food. And then she started screaming and running at him. He slammed the door and that's when he called the police to the scene. The officer found blood and claw marks on the door from her fingernails. He was searching the area when he got another call saying the woman had returned, but this time she was round the back of the house. It was dark, but he found her with his flashlight. She was crouched on the ground with her evil looking doll next to her. She didn't respond to the officer, she only whispered at her doll. Her clothes were in rags, she had no shoes on, she just kept turning her head slightly to the side and growling in between the whispers. When the officers tried to move her, she went berserk and started attacking them. They had to knock her out and drag her to hospital where she tested positive for PCP and other opiates. Well, what a note to end on. How do you guys feel about all of those stories? Are you watching this at night in bed? Are you hoping that I just keep talking now because you're a little bit creeped out? Or do you want a part 2 right away? Let me know your thoughts in the comment section below. My name is Danny Burke. Thank you as always for watching, guys, and I'll see you all in the next video.